Welcome to you all. I am Dr. Crystal Downing, and I am the co-director with my husband, taking photographs, Dr. David C. Downing of the Marion E. Wade Center, where you are sitting right now. And as most of you probably know, it is the most comprehensive collection in the world for published and unpublished materials by and about C.S. Lewis and 6 of his most important influences. Tonight's lecture is funded by the Stephen and Marjorie Mead Endowment for Spiritual Formation, established last year by friends of the Wade who adore Marge Mead as a memorial to Steve and in honor of Marge. This fund supports research and presentations about spiritual formation as it relates to our 7 authors. And so I encourage any of you here who are really interested in the topic of spiritual formation and are fascinated by one or more of our authors to consider proposing a presentation for which we have grant money. So that's something to keep in mind. Tonight's lecture is unprecedented in several ways. Not only is it the inaugural lecture funded by the Mead Endowment, but it is the very first lecture that the Wade has hosted to focus on the issue of depression, a subject that makes many Christians uncomfortable. They just don't want to talk about it. But thanks to Wheaton College's Year of the Arts, which includes an installation of paintings about depression, which can be seen at the Mead Art Gallery over in Armerding, the Wade felt led to contribute to the campus-wide conversation about art and melancholy. After all, George MacDonald, whom C.S. Lewis calls his master, saying that MacDonald left his imprint on almost every single thing that C.S. Lewis wrote, that George MacDonald struggled with depression. He actually dropped out of university for a term, struggling with his faith, going through a very dark time. In fact, he disappeared. Even his son in later years has no idea where he was for that time, where he was just trying to figure life out. They know he was in the northern part of Scotland, but they don't know for sure where he went. G.K. Chesterton, another one of our authors who influenced Lewis, was unable to get out of bed for 3 months after Britain entered the Great War. Dorothy L. Sayers reported that she cried continually, not continuously, but continually for 3 years in her late 20s. And C.S. Lewis himself suffered bouts of what his brother called the Celtic melancholy, perhaps explaining why he felt so connected to MacDonald, Chesterton, and Sayers. All of them, of course, worshipped a Savior who cried out from the cross, "Father, Father, why hast thou forsaken me?" And I encourage you, after the talk tonight, to peruse the handwritten and hand-illuminated St. John's Bible near our museum, where the speaker tonight will be selling and signing her books. We have it open to a gold leaf image of the crucifixion. But now it seems only appropriate that Marjorie Mead, who has served the Wade for nearly 45 years, be the one to introduce the speaker for the inaugural lecture of the Stephen and Marjorie Mead Endowment. Marge.
Thank you, Crystal. It is a true joy to have Dr. Ruth Barton with us. as our inaugural speaker. This endowment, as Crystal noted, only exists due to the generosity of many friends of the Wade. I am deeply grateful for each person who has made this evening possible. Dr. Barton is well known and highly regarded in the spiritual formation community. For more than 20 years, as founder of the Transforming Center, she has guided leaders in establishing sacred rhythms in their own personal and professional lives, which is part of her desire to see churches become centers of spiritual transformation. Some years ago, I was privileged to take a graduate course at the college that Dr. Barton was teaching, based upon her book, Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership. It was a tremendously worthwhile and enjoyable course. Even today, I continue to reflect upon the truths she shared then. Dr. Barton is the author of numerous books and resources. Each one of them is worthy of your time. However, if you are new to spiritual discipline practices, I would particularly recommend her Invitation to Solitude and Silence, as well as her work, Sacred Rhythms. Like C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, these books are not just intended for those beginning this part of the spiritual journey, however, but rather they are of genuine value to the more experienced follower as well. Whether you are here in person this evening, listening via the live stream, or at a later date to the recording, each one of us is coming to hear Dr. Barton's words from a variety of differing perspectives and needs. But one thing is a constant. As C.S. Lewis wrote to one of his correspondents in 1951, continue seeking God with seriousness. Unless he wanted you, you would not be wanting him. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ruth Haley Barton as she speaks on Finding God in the Darkness, Spiritual Formation Through Depression and the Dark Night of the Soul. Dr. Barton.
I'm truly not worthy of that introduction, but thank you very, very much. Kind of a surreal experience to prepare to speak at your alma mater where you bopped around as an 18 and 19-year-old and did all the crazy things that we all do. Maybe I didn't do as many crazy things as some people, but I did do a few. And it's really fun to be among some of my friends, my family, some from the Transforming Center, and all of you who are interested in this really, really important topic. It's a privilege to be among you. First of all, helping with this inauguration of the Wade Center's new endowment in spiritual formation. I congratulate everyone who had a part in making this a reality. What a wonderful moment to celebrate. And then I'm also just really intrigued and thrilled with the topic. I think this is a very important moment in our Christian history to talk about the importance of this topic of depression and the dark night. And I was invited to speak about depression, but I find it really difficult to speak just about depression, because I think if we don't speak about the dark night of the soul at the same time, we can get confused about what it actually is that we're talking about. And so I was just really thrilled that you were able to let me expand the topic and talk about the dark night of the soul as well. I also want to thank you, Marjorie, for your help and for your support in my preparations. It was a real gift to me. I don't want tonight to be somber, although our top topic is a little bit somber. But what I do hope for tonight is that we can have a gentle evening. An evening that is gentle with our souls, focusing on some of the more tender places in the human experience. I'm sure that every generation feels on some level like they are going through a uniquely difficult period of time, hard to endure in terms of human suffering and its effects. But where we are right now in the human community is pretty bad, don't you think? It feels pretty bad to me. The hard things just keep piling up with no time to recover ourselves in between. So before we had even fully emerged from the pandemic and recovered from all the fear and the isolation and the losses that went along with that, we were in the middle of great political unrest, which had been building until finally it expressed itself in a culminating way in the January 6th insurrection. And that investigation still goes on. If anybody's paying attention, the investigation is still progressing and the revelations are deeply disturbing. There is the racial reckoning that we are in the midst of in our country that is highlighted by the, in many cases, unjustifiable killing of Black people, sleeping in their beds, sitting in their living rooms, jogging in the neighborhood, stopped for routine traffic violations, emerging from a convenience store. It is too much and it hurts. And it's traumatic, the images that we've seen in our most recent history. And we know that we have a lot of work to do. We all know it and we feel it. And then there's the hashtag #MeToo, ChurchToo movement, which has produced wave upon wave of revelations about moral failures and shortcomings among respected Christian leaders, aided, of course, by the complicity of churches and organizations and denominations in which they served. And these relentless waves just keep crashing upon the shores of our psyches, till at some point we can't process anymore, and we just go numb. I wonder how many of us sitting in this room tonight have gone a little bit numb with the revelations that we've had to endure. And now, of course, we're in the middle of a brutal war in the Ukraine, brought on by the unprovoked invasion of an independent nation in a power-hungry and despotic attempt by a leader to overtake a sovereign nation. This leader's ongoing barbaric actions are now a threat to worldwide peace. And if we're paying attention at all, we know that this is true. That is a lot of weight for human beings to carry. And so no wonder depression is on the rise. There are lots of places where you can go to find statistics about anxiety and depression, but the CDC is describing an increase of adults reporting symptoms of anxiety and depression from 36.4% to 41.5%. I'm sure there's lots of places where you can get similar statistics. Children 5 to 11 years old reporting a 24% increase in emergency visits related to mental health in their young little lives. Adolescents from 12 to 17 years old have increased 31% in terms of their visits to emergency facilities for mental health issues. So this is where we are. And so while many generations probably feel that they've gone through really horrific times, I think there is something that could be said for this period of time that we're in and the weight that the human race is carrying right now. But even as we recite this litany of hard things that threaten the mental health and the spiritual vitality of human beings, tonight's gathering in this very esteemed center remind us that times of great suffering and great turmoil can also be the catalyst for great creativity, as some of the Wade authors have demonstrated. I have with me a recent article by Joseph LeConte that talked about similar dark times for C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien, dark times that produced some of the most dearly loved stories and characters that came from their pens. So the title is How the Suffering of World Wars Seeded the Creativity of J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. The next few years will be ghastly, wrote C.S. Lewis in September of 1939, just 2 weeks after Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Although a man of faith, Lewis confessed to a friend that his nerves were often staggered by the news from week to week, and don't we feel that way? The news from week to week is very tough to bear. A combat veteran of World War I, Lewis described the ghostly feelings that it has all happened before. Writing at the same time, J.R. Tolkien explained to his publisher that the anxieties and troubles that all share, coupled with new responsibilities in this bewildering community, had made him unpardonably neglectful of his efforts to finish his sequel to The Hobbit. But while the war brought unspeakable suffering, it also contributed to the creation of some of the most beloved and heroic literature of modern times. And despite these anxieties, both of these authors entered a season of intense creativity. Tolkien had begun writing The Lord of the Rings in 1937. Shortly after The Hobbit was published, the story languished for months, but he picked it up in earnest in late August of 1940. And so over the next few months, Tolkien brought his worlds and his languages to life. And it was the same with C.S. Lewis. The Chronicles of Narnia were in his mind when he began to write those chronicles, because he writes a story about 4 English children when they were sent away from London during the war because of air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor. And so in times that are very similar to our own, we realize that there were authors that God used to bring out wonderful, creative writings for us to all enjoy. And these 2 authors used the language of myth and fairy tale to communicate hard truths about the human condition. So I give you that as an encouragement as we begin tonight, that there are good things that come out of these difficult times, and not to be superficial in that kind of an encouragement, but sometimes it takes these very, very deep waters to catalyze some of the most creative things that come out of us. So in addition to using this moment tonight to talk about depression in a spiritual context, and to begin with the encouragement that these difficult times can produce great things in our lives and in our public offerings, it is also an important moment, I think, to talk about the dark night of the soul as a season that is distinct from depression. And it is a necessary passage in the spiritual life. Some of the symptoms can be the same and feel similar. They can happen simultaneously, but there are real differences between depression and the dark night of the soul. And these two human experiences, they're fundamentally different in terms of what they are about and how we might respond to them. And I think it'll be very helpful for us, for ourselves, how we accompany ourselves on the journey, how we accompany others on the journey, for us to know the difference and to know what can be helpful in both of these human experiences. I come to you as a trained spiritual director who has had the privilege of experiencing a strong integration of psychology and spirituality, both in my own personal spiritual journey, but also in my training and practice as a spiritual director. And so I have long been passionate about the danger to ourselves and to others when we conflate depression and the dark night of the soul, and when we are unclear about the differences, because it can lead us to misdiagnose what's really going on. And such misdiagnosis can result in overly spiritualizing our treatment of depression, actually slapping spiritual solutions too glibly onto psychological and maybe even sometimes physiological issues. You know, we say things like just pray about it or be anxious for nothing, you know, using scripture to over spiritualize real depression that has its roots even in our physiology. And then another result, though, of our misdiagnosis can also be that we offer psychological remedies and even medicate the necessary spiritual passage of the dark night of the soul. Both of these are grave mistakes, and my hope is that tonight we can look at these dynamics of the human experience and get clear so that we can accompany ourselves and accompany others in this world. And I want to do that through the lens of just touching on some places in scripture, some authors that are here in the Wade Center. And I'm hoping that we will leave tonight feeling more equipped to accompany ourselves and others in these very challenging human experiences. So we're going to do some definitional work around both depression and dark night of the soul. Then we're going to give some perspectives on those conditions, and then some spiritual formation practices as seen in the lives of the Wade authors. And I'll probably mention some other experiences as well. I probably won't be able to talk about the dark night of the soul without mentioning Mother Teresa, of course. So that's where we're going, and we don't have enough time to do it all completely, but I'm hoping that even in the Q&A that we have afterwards, the things that are most important to you at a soul level, not just at an intellectual level, but at a soul level, that you will bring those questions out in our Q&A. Now, the fact that this is an inaugural event for spiritual formation, I also want to mention what my perspective is on a definition for spiritual formation. I think that's really important. And that is, in a Christian perspective, spiritual formation is the process by which Christ is formed in us for the glory of God, for the abundance of our own lives, and for the sake of others. So when we talk about practices tonight, we are going to talk about practices that literally open us to the transforming work of God, that work that we're not able to do for ourselves, but that God can do if we find ways to open. So let's make a beginning tonight by talking first of all about depression. When we use the word depression, it can have a variety of meanings because there are different kinds of depression. And I know we have real experts, psychological experts on these things in the room tonight, but let's just get on the same page together and use this definitional work to help us with the distinguishing that we're going to do as time goes by. So there's major clinical depression, and this is not the same thing as brief mood fluctuations or the normal feelings of grief and disappointment and frustration that we all move in and out of within the human experience. For major depression, the symptoms can last maybe weeks or even months, and it can be manifested in such symptoms as trouble concentrating, remembering details, making decisions. It actually affects our ability to function. So that's going to be a major distinction right there. Because in the dark night of the soul, many people continue functioning and functioning at a very high level. But when we're in the midst of a major depression, we often become non-functional. There can be an unexplainable fatigue, feelings of guilt and worthlessness and helplessness, feelings of pessimism and hopelessness, trouble sleeping or sleeping too much, irritability and restlessness, a loss of interest in things that you used to enjoy, your hobbies, sex, whatever, changes in our eating patterns and digestive issues that are unexplainable, physical symptoms like aches and pains, headaches and cramps. It's a physical in-the-body experience. There can be persistent feelings of sadness and anxiety and emptiness, and of course, maybe even suicidal thoughts and or attempts. In a major depression, it continues for at least 2 weeks or more and does not go away. And once physical causes are ruled out, then the treatment may include psychotherapy combined with medication. Depression can also be caused by brain structures, nerve pathways, or circuits that just don't work properly. Depression can run in families and be in our genes. Other kinds of depression would include situational or circumstantial depression, which is attached to life events, a longer period of time of being sad or grieving or listless or not able to get out of bed, but connected to life events, circumstances that are really hard and difficult. There are other conditions that can go along with depression, like ADHD, physical exhaustion after exertion. So for pastors and Christian leaders who step up and do really big things, they do that through their adrenaline as well as through their spiritual calling. And so once the event's over, we can have a depression afterwards because our hormones are coming back into balance. There can be persistent depressive disorders that go on for a long time. Bipolar depression, which is, the mood swings and the highs and the lows. And so the depression would be the low part of a bipolar situation. There are seasonal, people who respond to seasons with depression. So those are some of the physiological and psychological aspects of depression. Now, I also want to mention a few spiritual causes as well. And it's going to be up to you and the people that work with you in a helping way to help you to really discern what's really going on. And so depression does require that we have someone to walk alongside and to help us to understand what's going on. But some spiritual dynamics of depression could be harboring unconfessed sin. In Psalm 32, the psalmist says that when I kept silent about my sin, my body wasted away through my groaning all day long. The human psyche is not meant to bear the weight of unconfessed sin. It can just eat away at you. And in Psalm 32, we see that confession actually brought the psalmist out of his depression. Then I acknowledged my sin to you. In other words, I stopped hiding. I brought it out into the light, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. And there's this shift in the psalm from depression to gladness and joy, and the weight of sin just rolls off. I also want to mention demonic attack. I am not one who tends to see a demon behind every bush, but I do think that this kind of spiritual warfare needs to be named in a context like this. Because we know that, for instance, Job, he was subjected to real abuse by Satan. Satan asked for permission to test Job, and God gave permission, and so Job went through a demonic attack. Satan asked Jesus if he could sift Peter like wheat. And even Jesus in the wilderness, while I'm not sure I would call it depression, we know that there was a demonic attack on Jesus in the wilderness. And I'm sure it wasn't the height of his life at that point. Paul reminds us that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and the forces of evil. C.S. Lewis certainly acknowledged this dynamic, this part of depression in his book, Screwtape Letters. In fact, he actually conceived his satire, the Screwtape Letters, in times like ours. He conceived that book after he had heard Hitler on the BBC in 1940. And the next day, during a service at Holy Trinity Church, he imagined a book consisting of letters between a senior devil, Screwtape, and a junior tempter named Wormwood, whom he was mentoring. And so to C.S. Lewis, the problem of evil was very real, and probably in his mind would have at times affected how we find ourselves to be in the world. So those are some of the descriptions that we might give to this whole issue of depression. Let me read a psalm that also gives us, I think, a really powerful description of depression. Psalm 88 says, O Lord, God of my salvation, when at night I cry out in your presence, let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry, for my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like those who have no help, like those forsaken among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave, like those whom you remember no more, for they are cut off from your hand. You have put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions dark and deep. Your wrath lies heavy upon me. You overwhelm me with all your waves. You have caused my companions to shun me. You have made me a thing of horror to them. I am shut in so that I cannot escape. Wow. He's got it going on here. My eye grows dim through sorrow. Every day I call on you, O Lord. I spread out my hands to you. Do you work wonders for the dead? Do the shades rise up to praise you? Is your steadfast love declared in the grave? In other words, can I experience your love even in this place of deep depression? What a question that is. Or your faithfulness in Adabon? Are your wonders known in the darkness? Or your saving help in the land of forgetfulness? Like, can you reach me here? I mean, this is a soul crying out to God from the dark depths. But I, O Lord, cry out to you. In the morning my prayer comes before you. O Lord, why do you cast me off? Why do you hide your face from me? Wretched and close to death, from my youth up, I suffer your terrors. I am desperate. Your wrath has swept over me. Your dread assaults destroy me. They surround me like a flood all day long. From all sides they close in on me. You have caused friend and neighbor to shun me. Darkness is my closest friend. And so there we see one of the first spiritual practices of someone, the soul, who is suffering with depression, and that is the willingness to cry out to God and to be honest about it. And I want to move into some of the spiritual practices now that I believe are really effective as it has to do with depression. And first of all, it's the practice of telling the truth. You will know the truth, you will say the truth, you will live in the truth, and the truth will set you free. You know, many people don't want to acknowledge depression, as you said, Crystal. It's a very hard thing to acknowledge because for some reason, in the Christian experience, it's become something that feels shameful. And yet, you know, there in that scripture, we see it right there, that there's a great Christian writer who's writing about depression. We think about Elijah, who left his life in the company of others and left his life in the company of the Israelites and his ministry. And he's definitely in the depths of depression. There's, you know, every single thing about his experience characterizes what we've just described. And he slumps down into the solitary broom tree and he says to God, it is enough now, O Lord, just take my life, which would be the very definition of clinical depression. So the first thing is the ability to tell the truth. And I want to name that as a spiritual practice. That it is a spiritual practice to name where we are in this sort of an honest way. And then also, as the process and as the thing unfolds, after we've told the truth and hopefully told the truth to at least one other person who can help, but the close ones around us, rather than continuing to deny what's going on in our souls, the scriptures tell us that it opens us up. It opens us up to the freedom journey. To tell the truth opens us to the process of God working with us and being with us in those places. And then as the journey continues to deepen, to tell the truth in those deep places of our self-talk and to challenge our self-talk with the truth of Scripture. You know, a depressed person almost always has self-talk tapes that they run in their minds and they say them to themselves. And so there's another aspect of truth telling where we actually bring the truth that is from God and we bring the truth of Scripture and we challenge the self-talk that just is not accurate, the dark thoughts that do not represent reality. So to tell the truth, that's the first practice that I want to name as it has to do with depression, is that we at least get to the place where we can tell the truth about our condition. We tell it to God, we tell it to people who can help. We invite our close ones in and let them walk with us also. You will know the truth and the truth will set you free. And then we allow God's truth to challenge the untruth in our self-talk when that is what's needed. I would also like to name as a spiritual practice that getting help is a spiritual practice. Getting help from a therapist or a spiritual director or a pastor is a spiritual practice. Just like you would get help for a broken leg or a cancer diagnosis, I believe that we need to see psychological therapy as part of our spiritual practice. And then in the context of that relationship, if there are medications that can be offered, that we see those as gifts from God as well, and that we receive those when they are helpful and safe as we discern that. So to see getting help, professional help, and even receiving medical help as we discern that, that's a part of our spiritual practice. In fact, there's evidence that the combination of therapy and medication can provide relief for 80 to 90% of depressed people. That's extraordinary. And to think that many Christians don't receive that kind of help because there's something shameful to them about depression it's a travesty, it's a tragedy. To think that there are people who are living with depression who don't have to because they're not willing to get this sort of help. So I'm preaching a little bit now, but I really believe strongly about that as a spiritual practice. What's a spiritual practice? It's a way of opening to the transforming work of God. And getting professional help is a way of opening to what God wants to do in our lives. Another spiritual practice would be to get into your body. This body that is the temple, this place where God wants to meet you. Depression is a whole body experience, and we need to pay attention at the level of our bodies. And so once we've gotten professional help and maybe we've gotten some support through medication, we want to make sure that we're exercising, whether you feel like it or not. God has given us the gifts of endorphins in our bodies. And so when one is wrestling with depression, to increase exercise in order to increase the endorphins that can flow into our bodies and receive those endorphins. So be in your body and fight it with your body. Eat healthy and well. Try not to give in to self-medicating with substances like alcohol, drugs, sugar, and overeating. But live in your body as the temple where God wants to meet you. And then sometimes just get up and do something. Anything, whether you feel like it or not. I really believe that C.S. Lewis had an understanding of depression because there are little things that he would put in his stories that let me know that he knew what he was talking about because he had seen a thing or two in his own life. So I'm reminded of Prince Caspian, where Jill and her little friend Scrub have this wrestling match on the side of a cliff, and in the whole process, Scrub tries to save Jill, but Scrub falls off and Jill doesn't, and she just feels terrible. And she's crying and crying. She feels guilty and she just despises herself. But there's this moment that she gets to, and I don't think C.S. Lewis could have written this if he hadn't experienced it himself, where he says, crying is all right in its way while it lasts, but you have to stop sooner or later, and then you still have to decide what to do. So when Jill stopped, she found that she was dreadfully thirsty. She went to find water, and it opened up the whole encounter with Aslan. So sometimes we just have to get up and do the next thing that is the right thing to do for ourselves. And in the act of getting up and taking care of our basic human needs, Jill in particular gets unstuck, and her story starts to open up from there, and it starts to be redeemed. So sometimes just get up and do something, whether you feel like it or not, the next thing that's the right thing to do. Definitely pour your heart out to God in prayer. C.S. Lewis was an avid prayer. His practice of prayer would put most of us to shame, that's for sure. He struggled with prayer. His mother died when he was young, and she suffered from cancer, and he was instructed as a little boy to pray for her healing, and she was not healed. And so he had a really uncomfortable relationship with prayer as time went on. He gave it up for a while, but then he came back to it. And when we read about his prayer practices, we can see a man of a deep spirituality who, no matter what was happening in his life, was always reaching for God. And so in depression, pour out our heart to God, just like the psalmist did in Psalm 88. Start a journaling practice or a writing practice. And I actually think that a grief observed, it's so funny today to go back to all of my books from 1980. They're all old and yellow. And, I was reading them when I was 19 and knew nothing about any of it, Sometimes I know that education is wasted on the young. When I think about what I received here at Wheaton College, when I think about the books we read, when I think about the speakers that went across the stage and we're whispering and sleeping and everything else, while some of the greatest speakers in the country and the world are right up there on the chapel stage. I mean, it's just embarrassing to look back. But, C.S. Lewis suffered another great loss in his life, and that was the loss of his wife, Joy. And it was a late in life romance, and they had a real romance. And C.S. Lewis wrote and wrote and wrote, and he wrote A Grief Observed. I'm actually going to bring this book out again when we talk about The Dark Night as well. But this was his way of getting after it. He just wrote and wrote and wrote about the grief that he was experiencing. Get creative. Trust creativity as a way of partnering with God. And I've already mentioned that oftentimes those moments when we are suffering and those moments that feel darkest, if we can stay with God and with ourselves in it versus just self-medicating, then God can bring something out of the depths. And the Wade authors definitely show us that. Trust the creative possibilities in what you are suffering. Allow yourself to be creative, even in the darkest moments. And then I'm going to close this practice with the last one from J.R.R. Tolkien, and that is going to communion. Keep going to union. I have an article here that says that J.R.R. Tolkien's epic cure for frustration and depression and doubt was going to communion. He was a devout Catholic, and when his son Michael, when he was 43 years old, was depressed, looking for consolation, Tolkien had this response: the only cure for sagging and fainting faith is communion. Though always itself perfect and complete and inviolate, the Blessed Sacrament does not operate completely and once for all in any of us. Like the act of faith, it must be continuous and grow by exercise. Frequency is the highest effect. 7 times a week is more nourishing than 7 times at intervals. Well, as a Protestant, I don't relate to that very well. I know that Marjorie and I share a really dear friend, Marilyn Stewart. And so Marilyn was a dear friend of mine for many, many years. I was in a group with her when I was just a beginning spiritual director at a very young age. She and some of her friends welcomed me into their peer supervision group. And then eventually several of us broke off, and she and I and my friend Adele Calhoun did group spiritual direction with each other for probably at least 5 years. And I remember sort of being in awe of her calling. She had a very clear sense of her own calling, and it was a hard calling. And I would ask her sometimes, how do you endure? How do you keep that up? And she said, by receiving the Eucharist. And I thought, man, we as Protestants, we don't receive it that way. We receive it as being a symbol of something versus a reality. But she was literally strengthened by taking communion day after day after day. And I found myself feeling a little envious sometimes that she had that experience with the Eucharist that I, as a Protestant, didn't have to the same extent. Interestingly enough, Tolkien actually writes in the power of this special type of bread into his Lord of the Rings series. It was a bread called lembas, which sustained Frodo and Sam as they reached the place where their journey ended. And this kind of bread had virtue without which they would long ago have lain down to die. It did not satisfy desire, and at times, Sam's mind was filled with the memories of food and a longing for simple bread and meats. And yet, this bread of the elves had a potency that increased as travelers relied upon it alone and did not mingle it with other food. It fed the will, and it gave strength to endure and to master sinew and limb beyond the measure of mortal kind. Isn't that something? He wrote his love of communion and the strength that he received through communion right into his novels. So those are some ideas. I think those are some spiritual practices that are really concrete that we can engage in and that we can offer to others when depression is what we are dealing with. But now I'd like to talk to you about the dark night of the soul. And there is going to be some Q&A, so write your questions down, hold them, because I really want to hear your questions and your responses when we're finished here. But let's go on and talk about the dark night of the soul before we do our Q&A. This is a very different experience than depression. And if we don't talk about it this way, we're not going to get clear on what the distinctions are. The language of the dark night of the soul comes from Jonathan Cross's poem, The Dark Night, in which he describes the soul's journey to union with God. And the night refers to the journey of faith. It refers to the encounter with the mystery that is God beyond our ability to know it in our normal ways and with our normal faculties. And it also refers to the purification of our attachments, and particularly our attachments to our thoughts and conceptions about God. So you can already see these are two very, very different things. So knowing about the dark night helps us to name and accept and understand ours and others' spiritual development. In other words, it helps us to understand what's really happening in our spiritual lives when this is what is happening. So by definition, the dark night of the soul is not something that happens to beginners in the faith. It is something that happens to those who have some sort of proficiency in the spiritual life, which I'm assuming is most people in this room. These are people who feel that they've made some progress in the spiritual life, but the juice or the normal consolations are now gone and missing. The dark night begins when we realize that our spiritual efforts have been subtly building up our own ego and our own worldview in a way to keep us safe and secure, and that our cherished notions of God are essentially false idols. Very different than depression. You could be depressed at the same time, but this is different. So in this place, first of all, you might try some denial. You might just try harder and harder with your spiritual practices, more prayer practices, going to more worship, listening to more teaching, reading more books by Christian authors. You try harder and you keep denying how bad it really is. Then you might feel some anger, that God is not showing up the way he has always shown up for you in the past. So you feel kind of angry with God and with yourself, perhaps disappointed that you're not doing better spiritually. Then there may be darkness and emptiness, feeling of not knowing, a period of dark waiting where you don't know that anything's going on. All you can do is wait. There's a helplessness to do anything for ourselves because there isn't really anything you can do about the dark night of the soul. The dark night of the soul is the realm in which God is the only one who can do anything. There is no human help for the dark night of the soul, except for a spiritual director, which we'll talk about in a minute. Eventually, there is a kind of humility and surrender, and maybe even some sort of a conversion experience. Not the initial conversion experience, but the conversion experience that comes to us over and over again as we grow in the Christian faith. So traditionally, there are two parts of the dark night of the soul. First of all, there's the dark night of the sense, where God purposely withdraws the soul's normal consolations found through prayer, study, and service. The normal things of God no longer hold any attraction to us. Nothing happens anymore. We try all the stuff we used to know, and nothing happens anymore through our normal prayer practices and study practices and service. But what distinguishes this time, perhaps from depression, is that our desire for God is strong. And so we still have this longing for God. We're still searching and trying to find ways to open, but our external consolations have now been stripped away. Nothing that has worked before works anymore. The dark night of the sense, which is the normal consolations, are stripped from us. And then there's the dark night of the spirit. So this is the second part, where God withdraws even the inner experience of God's existence and love. And Mother Teresa was one who articulated her experience of the dark night in one of the most effective ways I've ever heard. She says, "I'm told that God lives in me, and yet the reality of darkness and coldness and emptiness is so great that nothing touches my soul." This is a loss of a felt sense of God's presence. So God feels absent. God has gone behind the cloud. God is not allowing God's self to be perceived or felt at this time. And of course, we know that Mother Teresa's experiences of the dark night lasted her for 50 years, which was shocking. Once she passed away, it was shocking to realize how much of her life she lived not feeling the feelings that we often think is going along with our faith. The dark night of the sense and the dark night of the spirit are not necessarily sequential, but oftentimes they might even happen simultaneously. So this is definitely where the soul is beyond the honeymoon stage, where we do feel lots of things. This is a description of a mature soul who now is no longer needing all the bells and whistles in order for faith to be real and in order to stay faithful. And this is where the dark night of the soul differs from depression. Depression is an illness. It's a psychological disruption that it is appropriate to want to care for and to heal as much as is possible. It is treatable in most cases. It's a psychological disorder. But the dark night of the soul is a natural part of the spiritual life. And the thing to do with the dark night of the soul is not to medicate it or try to fix it in any way, but actually to let go into it. You don't try harder with more spiritual practices. You let go of the need to accomplish anything. And in fact, another word is disintegration, a positive kind of disintegration, like what happens to the caterpillar in the cocoon. Are you aware of what happens to a caterpillar in a cocoon? They actually disintegrate. It actually becomes kind of a soupy mess before it then begins to build itself back up into a cocoon. The dark night of the soul is not something that can be cured, and it shouldn't be cured, because it is actually a really significant passage in the spiritual life. In fact, John of the Cross says that if you can find something that makes you feel better, you're probably not having a genuine dark night. There are no solutions to the dark night of the soul, except surrendering oneself to God. He says that bad humor should be treated with herbs and now with antidepressants, but the dark night of the soul cannot be treated. It's a genuine experience of our own helplessness. But there is hope in it as well, and that is hope for the more. And there's this sense that there is more, if you can just find a way to open. And so I'd also like to say that you can deal with depression in some of the typical ways through therapy and medication, but you can still be in a dark night. These things can even exist simultaneously. You can be fully functional and still be in a dark night. And you can enjoy simple pleasures and still be in a dark night. The dark night of the soul is a vital ingredient of a deep and authentic spiritual life. Before he passed away, I had the opportunity and a great privilege to study with Gerald May, who is a psychiatrist as well as a spiritual director. He was one of my teachers in my training in spiritual direction. And as he describes it in his book called The Dark Night, which I highly recommend, it's one of my favorites, he says that the dark night is not necessarily a time of suffering and despair, but rather a time of deep transition, during which our lives feel clouded and full of mystery as we move through a time of trial and uncertainty on the way to greater freedom and joy. And that the dark night of the soul is characterized by an increasing ability to abandon oneself to God, layers upon layers of abandonment. He says, and rightly so, that the dark night is a profoundly good thing. It is an ongoing spiritual process in which we are liberated from attachments and compulsions and empowered to live and love more freely. Sometimes this letting go of old ways is painful. Occasionally it's even devastating. But this is not why it is called dark. The darkness of the night does not imply anything sinister, only that liberation takes place in hidden ways, beneath our knowledge and understanding. It happens mysteriously, in secret, and beyond our conscious control. And for that reason, it can be disturbing or even scary, but it always works to our benefit. He even goes so far as to say that the dark night of the soul gives meaning to life. So rather than seeking to find relief from the dark night of the soul, as we can and should do when depression is involved, in the dark night, we're seeking to find meaning, even when we don't know what that meaning is yet. But we know the meaning is there. And this is why a spiritual director is so important around the dark night, is because the spiritual director will know the characteristics of the dark night. They will know how to distinguish the dark night from depression and other kinds of emotional disturbances. And they will know how to help us stay right there with God and with what God is doing. Mysterious as it may be, dark, that's the word, what the word dark means in the dark night of the soul. It means mysterious, unknown to us. There is a sense that something wonderful is at the heart of the dark night. And that there is something wonderful at the heart of our existence and all existence. There's a love for God, there's a love for one another, there's love for creation, and there's love for life itself. So even in this brief description, and I mean, I'm covering a lot of territory tonight in a very, very brief way. You could do a whole course on this and probably should, but I'm giving you the briefest descriptions. You can probably already tell that the dark night is very different than depression. That's why it's so important for us to have proper diagnosis in these things, is to have others helping us to know what's really going on. When one is in the throes of depression, there is not the sense of hopefulness that there might be in the dark night of the soul. In the dark night of the soul, there is this sense that it's really dark, but I'm right where I'm supposed to be. I'm right where God has me. That's what it feels like in the dark night, is that it feels dark. I don't know much. I may be in the middle of letting go, but I'm right where God has me. And that's where a spiritual director is so important, because a spiritual director can see that and name that and help you to distinguish it. Now, it's very dangerous if you're in a depression to have somebody thinking you're in a dark night. And we really ought not to mix up our language here, because the remedies for depression and dark night are very, very different. So in a depression, this sense of hopefulness is missing. With depression, we definitely want to do whatever we can to mitigate it. But with the dark night, we need support to abandon ourselves to the mysterious work of God, and to trust that there is a mysterious work of God going on, even when we cannot perceive it. So to be clear, the dark night of the soul has nothing to do with actually getting any closer to God. It is instead a journey of consciousness, not acquired or achieved by our own human effort, but it is realized. This is a time when we realize the closeness of God that is always there for us. We become more aware of the closeness of God. And we deepen our experience of love and surrender to love at the heart of God's purposes for us. In the dark night, there is a purification of our desires, where we get to the point where we want God and God alone. And at this place in the journey, we don't try to fix or medicate or problem solve or pray harder or respond with easy and trite answers. We trust ourselves to the work of God that's taking place in the dark. And that's the other reference of the dark night, is that God is working in the dark. God is working beyond our awareness. God is working beyond our consciousness and our ability to perceive what God is doing. So can you see the difference between depression and the dark night? This is really, really important, and God is with us in both. That is the good news. God is with us in both, but our response and the remedies are different. So what are some of the practices that might support and catalyze our transformation in the dark night experience? Well, the first one I've already mentioned, spiritual direction, I think is pretty much essential in the dark night. And oftentimes spiritual direction is essential for us to even know that that's what we're in. A spiritual director will be one who can actually name and say, this is what's happening for you right now, which is very, very helpful, because if you don't know that you're in the dark night and you try to medicate it because you think you're depressed, you're going to really miss out on what God might have for you. And, it's vice versa too. If you are depressed and medication would help, but you think you're in some spiritual thing that can't be impacted by medication, that's a dangerous place to be as well. And you're just going to spin your wheel. Medication won't help the dark night, because the dark night is a spiritual dynamic. So you want to know where you are on the journey at that point. And spiritual direction can be really, really helpful. The practices of silence and solitude, what we might also call passive prayer or the prayer of the heart, these are the practices that are very helpful during this time. This is the practice where we accept that what most needs to be done in our lives is only going to be done by God himself. And that in fact, God is already doing it by stripping away some of the normal things that we rely on to feel good about ourselves. And so in silence in particular, or in passive prayer, we practice letting go. We literally practice letting go, sort of like Elijah did, in his story, where he let it all come out and then he just sat there in the presence of the Lord, and let God do what needed to be done next. So in silence, we practice letting go. We practice letting God be the one who's in control, and we leave ourselves open to the encounter whenever God chooses to give that encounter to us. And then also, we may be called to let go of some things during this time, to let go when it is time. Maybe to let go of those things that you come to see as mere scaffolding, things that have propped up your sense of self and God and where and how God might be found. It is not unusual at all for this period of time in the dark night for there to need to be some letting goes. And I've had at least one of those big ones in my life, and actually two, where there were big letting goes that needed to take place in order for me to be open to what was next. So you'll want to practice letting go when it is time. And then if you can write. I have wondered if, I sometimes wondered in his book, A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis, I had wondered for a long time what was actually going on in this book. Was it depression? Was it normal grieving? Was it a dark night? But in going back over this work for this talk, I am now convinced that this was a dark night experience for him. It's written about the death of his wife, Joy, but it's more than just the normal grieving that takes place. Because eventually, as he wrestles with God, his relationship with God changes. And let me read just a little passage. So the whole, A Grief Observed is him wrestling with the grief of losing the love of his life. And he has laid out all his questions. He's been very faithful to write and to ask and to wrestle with all of it in his relationship with God. But then he says this, and this is what I think distinguishes this particular experience as a dark night of the soul for him. So he's laid out all his questions. He says, when I lay these questions before God, I get no answer, but a rather special sort of no answer. It is not the locked door. It is more like a silent, certainly not uncompassionate gaze, as though he shook his head, not in refusal, but waving the question like, peace, child, you don't understand. Can a mortal ask questions which God finds unanswerable? Quite easily, I think. All nonsense questions are unanswerable. And now when I've come to think of it, there's no practical problem before me at all. So I think that for C.S. Lewis, the death of Joy sent him not just into normal grieving, but also into a dark night where the normal consolations were no longer there, and he was willing to receive God on God's own terms for him. So I definitely think that if you can write, go ahead and write. Lay out your questions before God, say whatever you need to say to God on the way to union with God, a deeper level of union with God. And then go about your life and let God do the work. I think that's what we do in the dark night. We go about our lives, maybe no one else knows that we're going through a dark night, but we know it. And we know that God is quietly and silently stripping away those things that aren't real anyway. And that the real spiritual journey is unfolding in the darkness. It's unfolding underneath consciousness, underneath our consciousness. God is doing God's good work. I believe we can have more than one dark night, or we can have a very long one. But the dark night of the soul is more than just a rough patch. It's more than just a hard time, or even the grief of losing a loved one. It can be brought on by a really hard experience, but it is more than the normal grief. It feels more like a crisis of faith, where we are forced to let go of things that we usually cling to in order to abandon ourselves more fully to God. So friends, I am prayerful that as we listen to these teachings tonight, that we will be able to find God, whether it's a depression or a dark night of the soul, that we will be able to distinguish between depression and dark night, because they are treated differently. They can happen simultaneously, but what is needed for each one is different. And it's important to be able to discern what it is so that we open up to the opportunities in the most appropriate way. I would also really encourage you to sometimes just do the normal things, whichever one it is, whether it's depression or whether it's dark night, just do the normal things. Go outside, look up at the sky. Remember that there is a God who loves us and holds us even when we cannot perceive it. Take advantage of the human solutions that are here given to us. take advantage of what's offered to us through the discipline of psychology and through the medications that we've discovered that really do help in these things. But if it's not clinical depression, know that there may be something else going on inside, that God may be at work, that God might be inviting you into the deeper places with him. And although it might feel empty and you might feel abandoned, God has just gone behind the cloud. Because one of the purposes of the dark night is that we would stop relying on the externals of good feelings, feelings of intimacy, all of God's rewards, but that we would instead love God darkly, love God without all the bells and whistles, but still find ourselves to be faithful. So Marilyn Chandler McIntyre says this in her little poem, What to Do in the Darkness. It's very simple. Go slowly, consent to it, but don't wallow in it. Know that it is a place of germination and growth. Remember the light. Take an outstretched hand if you can find one. Exercise unused senses. Find the path by walking it. Practice trust and watch for the dawn.
Let's thank. What we want to do is.
This is.
Oh. We're putting a microphone in the aisle so that you can come and ask questions because we all want to hear them. There's nothing more frustrating than listening to answers when you don't know the questions, which somehow seems relevant to the talk itself. I'm sure you found it extremely valuable. So please come up to this microphone and ask your question. I will bring the question and answers to an end in a bit. And then you will have a chance to go out into the regular part of the way, the museum, to look at the books that are for sale and also to look at the St. John's Bible, which was 12 years in the making. Okay, please, someone ask a question.
Thanks so much for that very illuminating lecture. As I read St. John of the Cross, he seems to suggest that the mystical way is a journey that you embark on intentionally. And so there's the initial sense of opening yourself to God in nature, in your soul. There's a process of illumination and purgation, and that leads to the dark night of the soul. Would you say that, and then eventually after the dark night of the soul comes a communion with God or almost a union with God's consciousness? Would you say that you can experience the dark night of the soul without embarking upon spiritual disciplines? Does it just happen to you? Or would you say this is a part of the process of purification and illumination, which is a conscious effort on the Christian's part?
That's a great question. There's both active and passive parts of the journey. And so, you know, we usually as humans take the active part first and we do all that we can actively in our relationship with God. And then eventually there comes a time when we realize that what most needs to be done in our lives can't be done by our own human effort. And that's when we move into the passive night. So John of the Cross would identify an active night and a passive night. And so in the active night, we're still doing some of those things that we know to do. Reading scripture, praying, meditating, you know, going to church, all the things that support a spiritual journey. But then there comes a point when we realize that nothing in our activity or in our actions is going to accomplish what most needs to be accomplished in our lives. And then we move into a more passive night, where we realize that now what most needs to be done in our lives, only God can do. And of course, we say that early on in the spiritual life, but we still have lots of our scaffolding in place and think that we're doing stuff by our own spiritual disciplines and practices and things like that. But in the passive part of the dark night, we realize that what most needs to be done in our lives, only God can do. And again, this is a place where there's a part of the writings of C.S. Lewis that actually gets to this, I think. And that is in the story of Eustace being on Dragon, where he tries to get the skins off himself. He's the little boy who's become outwardly what he always was inwardly. And so there's this moment when he meets Aslan, and he thinks that the whole process is going to be him getting off his own skin. So that's the active night right there. There's something I can do to change my situation and to change myself. But he tries 3 or 4 times, and then finally Aslan says, it's not going to do any good, you're going to have to let me do it. And so that's really a picture of the passive night. And that is when, and I these days, given our sensitivities around sexual violence and things like that, the story can be a little hard in that context, because it says that I lay back and let him do it. That Eustace lay back and let Aslan get that final skin off. But that is a picture of the passive night right there, is that there comes a point where we know that what most needs to be done in our lives, only God can do, and finally we lay back and let him do it. Yeah. Does that answer the question? Thank you. What else? Hi.
Ruth, I wanted to say thanks for this talk. My small group studied, we went through one of your books, The Sacred Rhythms, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that work can be useful for those either struggling with depression or going through the dark night of the soul. I wonder if you could tie together the sacred rhythms that we study.
Well, that's a lovely, lovely question. Thank you. Well, spiritual practices, by definition, or the way that I understand them historically, is that spiritual practices are activities that we can engage in order to open ourselves to the work that only God can do. So we don't make things happen for ourselves within the spiritual practices, but there are certain spiritual practices that correspond to the human condition and to every aspect of the human condition, and that spiritual practices are ways of opening to God in these moments. And some spiritual practices correspond to some experiences that we have, and some correspond better. So in the way that I talk about sacred rhythms, it's always, or these spiritual practices, always about opening. It's always about yielding and finding ways to surrender. Romans 12:1 talks about the fact that we're to offer ourselves as living sacrifices, and that's a kind of a rough and disturbing image in some ways. But I see spiritual practices as the way we do just that we crawl up in the altar and we find ways to open ourselves to God, to surrender to God. And so there are different practices that are more helpful at different parts of the spiritual life. And so definitely the practices of solitude and silence are practices that we engage in when we come to the end of ourselves. So Bible study and active prayer with lots of words and prayer lists and service and all of those things, those do correspond to the early stages of the spiritual life, when we're still experiencing God more intellectually and we're experiencing ourselves to be active for God versus letting God be the active agent. And all of this is really important to our spiritual development. But then eventually there comes a place in the spiritual life where what is most needed is going to be practices that help us to surrender, And so solitude and silence in particular are practices that correspond very well to the dark night, because they are practices that we can engage in that help us to surrender, that help us to lay back and let God do it. Back to the C.S. Lewis story. I mean, the language there is a little bit disturbing. Eustace actually says, so I just lay back and let him do it, which is, disturbing language in our culture right now. But I believe that is C.S. Lewis really showing the heart of what it means to be in this dark place, is that there comes a point where we realize that we have to find ways to surrender. And so solitude and silence in particular are practices where we lay down our own human efforts to save ourselves and to change ourselves. And we literally lay back and let him do it, you know? Is that helpful? Yeah. I hope that connects dots for you. And then, you know, even after that, after God has stripped us of our reliance on these very active spiritual disciplines, then God provides us with forms of the disciplines that actually help us to surrender versus being so activistic about our own spiritual lives, you know, where we think we're going to do something in our spiritual lives. We think we're going to change ourselves. We think we're going to bring about our own transformation. But, you know, the dark night is often initiated by some awareness that what most needs to be done in my life, I don't know how to do it. I don't have the power to do it. I don't know how to do it. And I have to find a way to surrender. And so those are the practices then that, you know, lead us more and more into the dark night and into deeper levels of abandonment to God, really, which is the spiritual journey in the end. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I found, you know, a very serious problem of depression is the relapse of depression, you know. Sometimes the patient suffer from major clinical depression, you know, they said the medication, you know, is the first choice because at that time, you know, the connection between you and God, you know, is disconnected. So medication is the first choice or electroconvulsive therapy, you know. But do you think the medication or electroconvulsive therapy, you know, can be an obstacle for spiritual formation? I found that I feel medication or electroconvulsive therapy can, you know, make your nerve or your sensitivity, you know, less sensitivity, so you're not so sensitive to spiritual thing. And also there's other things that, you know, for those unbelievers, you know, so maybe Christian faith is, you know, not useful. There's other spiritual things. So could you, you know, say something about that? Because it seems,
Yeah, that is a bit beyond my knowledge, I will say. And I don't think that you could ever make a general determination about that. You'd have to actually be with someone clinically, working with them to know the answers to questions like that. So my hope, even in a talk like this, is that we as Christian professionals in the different areas get better and better at discerning what's actually needed and what would actually be helpful to someone spiritually. I don't have any experience with electroshock therapy. I know that that's, you know, something that's out there as a possibility, but I don't know enough about it to have a good spiritual perspective on that tonight. Is that what you were asking? Did I get your question?
yeah, anyway, you know, the medication, electroconvulsive
Yeah.
therapy, the relation between.
Yeah, well, I think medication, I'm certain that medication is God's gift to us at different times. And that to not take advantage of medication can leave someone in a dark place that they don't need to be in. And that oftentimes what happens is if we can deal with the depression that's happening on a physiological level and it can be dealt with on a physiological level and get that evened out, then they can open up, then that person can open up to spiritual realities versus having psychological barriers even to their spiritual life. But I think we have to be really careful and not medicate spiritual issues and not spiritualize about issues that need medication, you know, and that's where I think it's even a beautiful thing to see, you know, the practices of some of our spirituality come together with insight into what happens for us physically as human beings, because our bodies are temples and these things happen in our bodies. And we have to pay attention to the body and not misdiagnose. I think my greatest concern in these realms, and it's why I want to talk about both together, is that we misdiagnose and that spiritual directors and or therapists don't have a good enough understanding of both to even know how to diagnose what's most needed. And sometimes medication can actually get people to an even enough place where then they can begin to open up in and through the spiritual disciplines without whatever's happening in the body weighing them down and preventing them from fully opening and entering in. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for your lecture. I really appreciate it very much. Brief observation and question. What you're saying about surrender brought to mind the fact that it seems like we need to find a way to talk about that all surrender doesn't mean violence,
Yes,
right?
Mhm.
I mean, because of the time that we're in.
that's right. Thank you.
The language of surrender, like we play people, I just let it happen. The presumption, I think, for a lot of people is, how can you let such violence happen to you, right? Then that gets projected onto a vision of what it means for God to do things within us. So anyway, it just has me thinking about.
Thank you.
How do we?
Yes.
how do we
Yeah, so the
talk about that?
language is, it gives you a catch, and it gives me a catch too. Even, C.S. Lewis's way of representing that moment in Eustace's life, it's a bit problematic in our current culture, which is why I named it. That I just lay back and let him do it is kind of problematic, and yet there is a spiritual truth there.
Right.
Which is that in anyone's spiritual life, there is a moment when we give ourselves over to God in abandonment.
Right.
There's no other way,
Yes,
And-
yes, yeah,
So we gotta find the right language. We'll work together to find the right language, won't we?
yeah,
Because I realize that the language can be a barrier in these things.
Right.
Yeah.
yeah, sorry, I appreciate that catalyst. My question is, there are a whole bunch of them actually, but, I'll go with the Mother Teresa.
Okay.
As I'm sure you're aware, when the darkness was revealed, because people didn't know
Right,
she
right.
was alive, she would just presume to be this saintly person in Calcutta. Obviously, some people thought, well, see, that shows you what she really, in other words, it put into question
Mhm.
her faith, right? So how do we think about a way to talk about someone being in that kind of darkness, and who's doing what who stayed in Calcutta? She didn't go, to Malibu or something, right? So, how do we talk about that so that people don't think that the experience of darkness is itself evidence for her, participating in some kind of falsehood?
Say that last little part.
Yeah, in
again.
other words, I
Yeah.
think some people, they thought, here's Mother Teresa, turns out, she was this language about being far from God, not even sure about belief, etc. Did she really believe it?
Mhm.
So in other words, that kind of thing. So some people then that became a confirmation bias
Mhm.
that, well, who knows why she stayed, but it couldn't have been because she really believed what this church she was a part of was really
Yeah.
teaching.
Well, for one thing, I'm just aware as we talk about her that none of us really know the extent of her journey, and what she was actually experiencing. She was, even these things we didn't know until after her death. She was clearly a very private person. And so we in this room cannot say whether or not there was medication that could have helped her, whether there was depression going on for her, whether there was some combination of depression and dark night. We don't know what kind of support she had around her to even know those things. But I think all we can do is look at her life and know that there were others in scripture that we know, or we know that David struggled with depression. We know that Elijah struggled with depression. So we know that, or dark night, which however you want to look at it, and that these were and are very human experiences. And I pray that she had all the help that she needed. I don't know. I don't think we can know. But I do also think that her experience with God was real. Her experience of her call was real. And it's a pretty remarkable situation to know that she struggled with that kind of emptiness the whole while she was doing such amazing ministry for others. So I think we have to be really careful how we judge others in the faith. Come Be My Light is the book where she tells her story, and you can believe it or you can set it aside, but I don't know that it's even ours to judge, except that, she was very honest about her journey in the end in her own journals, and offers that to us as, I think, a place of understanding what Christians go through even in their faithful journeys, that there can be that kind of emptiness, and yet one can remain faithful and know that one still belongs to God, which she knew. She never doubted that. She didn't think he was a very good lover. She said that it surprised her that so many people would stay with him since he was not a very good lover. But she stayed and she was faithful. So well, there's a lot we'll never know about each other as human beings. I don't think we can know everything about her, what her experience with God was.
Thanks. And one last thing I want to say is I heard you on a podcast when I was driving to a retreat. And thanks to you, I now know the Dallas Stewart quote, if you don't come apart for a while, you come apart after a while.
That's right.
So now I quote that to my students all the time.
Good, yay.
So-
One good
So
thing.
what you're doing is
It's wonderful.
getting past.
Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. Anyone else? Yeah, here we come.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I'm just curious, you mentioned that the dark night of the soul is a necessary part to our spiritual life. And I'm curious about Christians that do not experience this dark night, or if that is even a thing not to, if you are a believer.
That's a really good question, and I haven't thought about that too much, probably because I've had my own experiences with dark night, so it's my world, it's my reality, but I don't have a good answer to that. Sometimes you look at people like that who just seem to be on such an even keel throughout their whole spiritual life, and you're almost jealous that they get to move through life so easily without ever having to experience the darker aspects of the spiritual life. But what I do know is that the great ones of our faith in Scripture and that we emulate, that this part of the journey is pretty routine. And so it's interesting that even in the life of C.S. Lewis, he didn't put a lot of weight on psychology, and he perhaps some of the things that we're talking about in the way that we're talking about them here tonight wouldn't resonate with him. But some people felt that he was rather wooden and didn't necessarily go all the way to some of the places that he could have in order to become fully healed. I mean, what I'm struck by is that these authors all had real traumas in their past. And we don't have a lot of information about how they dealt with those traumas. I mean, you know, he lost his mother when he was 10. Tolkien lost his father when he was 4, and then his mother when he was 12. There are really hard things that back in that day, they didn't deal with them all in the same way we would today. Those children, they just went on, and they went on to live very productive lives, thanks be to God, but didn't go to some of the places that these days we might think would be valuable to go to help children with the trauma of losing parents and things like that. That was something that wasn't offered to them. And so they shaped their spirituality around what was and wasn't there for them. But I think the scriptures, you know, do indicate that even the Paschal mystery speaks to death, burial, and resurrection as a fundamental aspect of a true spiritual life. That there is death, and what we mean by death is death to the false self, just waiting for God in the darkness, and then being raised to new life. That is the spiritual pattern. So I want to be careful in saying this, but it's possible that people who don't move through those kinds of places in the spiritual life may be functioning at a rather superficial level in the spiritual life, given the fact that the Paschal mystery, death, burial, and resurrection, is the basic spiritual rhythm. It's the basic rhythm of the spiritual life. Death to what's false so that what's true can emerge. And this waiting place, which is Holy Saturday, which we just, you know, passed through, that waiting place is the place where we wait for God to do the work that only God can do. And if we don't pass through those places, I'm really not sure what it is then. You know, what someone's spiritual life is if they haven't moved through these really fundamental places in the spiritual life that the scriptures are so clear about. Even Jesus himself had to go through the Paschal mystery, death, burial, and resurrection in order for the will of God to come forth in his life. So that's the basic pattern of the Christian life. Or another possibility is that people have gone through that, but they didn't tell anyone. You know, and that's another, we can't ever really know what someone has lived through and whether or not something like a dark night has taken place in their own life.
I'm wondering if there is such a thing as collective dark night of the soul, and politics aside, that is honestly the area, and you mentioned January 6th as part of what had sparked this. So it seems to me that idolatry is exposed in our cultural, political moment among American evangelicals in particular. And I'm wondering, sitting over here, is it for want of a kind of collective dark night of the soul that we are stuck and I'm looking at my parents' generation and my children's generation, like rejecting that faith that's so embedded with politics. And I'll stop talking because there's a lot more I could say, but would love to hear any thoughts.
Could you say the question again?
Yes.
I'm trying to hear through the question.
Is there such a thing as a collective dark night of the soul?
I think so, and I think that we, like Phyllis Tickle talks about the fact that every 500 years, there's a huge sea change, in our expression of faith, and I do feel that we may be in one of those right now, where our current expression of Christianity is going to have to go through a death and dying in order for something new to emerge, and for us to grow to a next level in our spirituality and in our faith. And sometimes the actual people in the generation have to die before that can happen. I mean, so the interesting thing in the book of Exodus is that there was the wilderness part of the journey where they waited for one generation to die before the new generation took the promised land. And so we could be in a place like that right now, where something's going to have to die, something's going to have to go away in order for what is new to emerge. I would not doubt if we are not in a place like that right now. And probably the best thing to do is not to cling and not make the death harder, but to find ways of letting go, even corporately, of things that just aren't working and that are empty and dead and dying. It's painful to say, but I think we may be in a time like that where some things simply have to die. They must die in order for what is new to come forth. The Pascal mystery, we're always in the middle of it. We're always someplace in the rhythm of the Pascal mystery, both as individuals and as groups. And God remains. We go through all of our death and dying, and God remains. Was there someone else?
Thank you for these questions. Let's thank Dr. Barton.